Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is May 12th, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with Bill Nichols, part two. Thank you so much, Bill. Where in the heck you calling in from?
I'm in San Francisco.
How cool
That's
is
in
that?
California.
And part one was completely intriguing and enlightening for me. So I thank you for that. So here we go with part two. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He checked out and basically said, why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, William Faulkner said that sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate or reproduce things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
I think it was the story is it was even cavemen who told stories.
Yeah.
And storytelling, I think is intrinsic to human nature. It probably is one of those myriad things that separates us from other animals. I don't know of other animals that tell stories, but some have languages, but they, like bees tell where to get honey or, pollen for honey. So there's something about human nature that we calls for storytelling. And that means that reality isn't enough, that somehow we have an urge to make sense of reality. And to make sense of reality, you have to reframe it in some way. Otherwise, you're just experiencing a flood of sensations, which is what animals do, and sort out the things that might be edible or dangerous or whatever. But we want to have something to hang those experiences on. And I think stories are what we hang them on. So I think there is in storytelling an impulse towards representing reality, which is the title of a book I did, but it doesn't apply only to fiction, to nonfiction and documentary. I think it applies to storytelling, that we want a way to represent or represent reality so that we can make more sense of it by framing it within what we would call a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. Because life itself, on a large scale, is endless. Time is endless. We come and go as individual mortals, but a story shrinks that passage down to a much more manageable length and gives it some kind of meaning and purpose. People did this because of that, whatever. And that's what I think it is. I think, we could go out of the theater and see a tree, but if you see a tree in a film and there's a rope around it and it has a noose, this is a story. Yeah. If it's, just in the background like Yellowstone, it's also a story, but it's a story of land and what it takes to possess, preserve, and protect land. So yeah, those stories, I think, are what one of the things that makes us human.
Beautiful. And Hollis Frampton said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. Can you forget to die?
I think we forget all the time.
Yeah.
And storytelling is, because it is absorbing and yet it ends, the story dies, but not the memory. And I think that idea that we are remembered and we remember stories may be part of the appeal. But yeah, I think we find all kinds of ways to postpone, delay, and ignore our own mortality. And I think creating stories or other types of narratives is one of the ways we do that. We become sucked into and absorbed in the flow of events that are now constituting a singular, specific, engaging experience that, ideally with catharsis and empathy and so on, brings us alive. It's a rescue from death, as it were, the thought of death.
A rescue, what a great word. And so, Bill, you've sort of touched on other videos online, but what was the tipping point where you found your calling to be a writer and an educator? You're going to college, you hear this friend say the word screenplay. You're studying, I think, chemistry, and you go, a screenplay. So you sort of had an epiphany. But where was that tipping point where you said, I want to be a writer, specifically film writer and an educator?
Well, I'll give you the longish answer, but because I was just telling another group that I've had a career without having a career path. That is, I didn't plan from early on, as some do, particularly people with great talents like musicians, from age 6 or 7 to do something, or tennis players and so on. But when I was at Duke, I was torn between arts and science. I did a chemistry degree. I was pre-med. I was accepted at Columbia Med School, and I got a bug to hitchhike out west. So after I graduated, I had, my big adventure, hitchhiking, a lot of different experiences, and wound up in San Francisco on a day trip down to Stanford. I was given a tour of the med school, and the professor of anatomy said, look, it's only June. Why don't you apply for the fall? I said, I thought he must be kidding. But I said, okay. So I filled out some papers, and lo and behold, I was accepted at Stanford Med School for that fall. So I turned Columbia down, got a drive away with some other people, one of whom became my best friend. And subsequently, although he was in history at Stanford and grad program, later became dean of film studies at UCLA. But I went there in medicine. I was still torn and had this idea that I could become a doctor, art patron person, and somehow combine the two. Stanford was intensely research oriented. I had classes with Nobel Prize winners, particularly biochemistry, which was just breathtakingly amazing because it was in the early days of DNA. And Arthur Kornberg had got his Nobel Prize for his work on DNA and taught the class with others. So that was really exciting, but it seemed to have nothing to do with the arts. So I was a little confused. I think if I'd stayed, I would have been fine, but I was a little confused about what I wanted to do. So that summer, it's a long answer, but I'll get to the writing. I got a job at California Public Health researching doctors' attitudes to birth control. And this is 1965. So still timely, given all the questions about right to life and, access to abortions. But I was somewhat shocked to find that doctors had widely varying attitudes towards birth control, depending whether they were urban or rural, depending whether they were Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, depending whether they were conservative or progressive. And it was all over the map, but in a systematic way. Anyway, while doing that, I applied to the Peace Corps. So instead of going back to Stanford, I spent the next 2.5 years in Kenya teaching in a school. So this was my introduction to teaching. It was also where I saw, I think in the time I was there, 6 films. Darling and Alfie were 2 of them that I still remember fondly. And somewhere along the way, as you said, I met a friend of a friend, one of my professors who became a friend who had a friend who was at time, who in a lunch or something said, and I'm also working on a screenplay. And I thought, what? I knew films were shot and I knew they got projected. So how on earth do you turn words on a page into image on a screen? It was like, even though I'd seen films and at Stanford even saw the Bergman trilogy with Winter Light and Silencio in a marathon afternoon, left staggering out of the theater. But it never occurred to me that someone wrote all that stuff down, or some of it. So since I always liked writing, this was like, some kind of eureka. And I thought, geez, I could write movies. So while I was still in Africa, I'd read Out of Africa by Isaac Denison or Karen Blixen, and thought I could do a screenplay. And in the course of that, I corresponded with her estate about her affair that left her with syphilis. And the producer in Hollywood, who little did I know had the rights, because I didn't know what rights were, to the story, contacted me and said, could you lay off talking to the estate about her condition? We're working on a screenplay out here and you're muddying the water. So that was interesting. But after I got back from Kenya, I spent a year in New York. I got a job, many jobs, but one was with Judith Christ, who did reviews for TV Guide and New York Magazine and the Today Show, and got accepted at UCLA. So I went to UCLA Film School thinking I'd be a screenwriter. And like a lot of things in those early days, because this is before film studies became established, courses were really, I would say, terrible. Coppola had come and gone through there, but like many of the people that did production and made films, it was pretty much up to you, and they had equipment you could use. That was basically it. And the screenwriting meant meeting the instructor, saying, you got something to work on? You say, yeah. Well, see me if you want, and otherwise give me your script at the end of the semester or quarter. So I did that a few times and thought, this is, okay. And meanwhile, I was required to take some study courses, so I was catching up on film. And I think the experience of watching lots and lots and lots of films, because like everything else, it was kind of Mickey Mouse, but it meant that the instructors mostly showed movies and made a few comments. There weren't lectures in the usual sense. So I caught up with a lot of films, and the idea of writing about them and reading about what other people had written about them was, I think, more magnetic than the hit and miss screenwriting world, which I was learning was not as, yellow brick roadish as one might wish. So I drifted into studies. I wound up doing my doctorate and got a job in Canada initially. But it was in the course of all that my writing interest, which I think was primary, found a focus on film as a topic. And, until recently, because now I'm trying to do some fiction writing, but, until recently, that's been where my writing has gone. So maybe that's an answer.
Well, Bill, that was a beautiful answer. In fact, a screenwriting teacher told me a great film or great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing a book?
A lot. One of the things, people write for all kinds of reasons. And as academic film studies took shape, because I began my career at the beginning of that process. I was in the first group of doctoral students at UCLA. I did a master's first, and there was a gap because there was no doctorate. And then I started the doctorate. And the number of places that offered doctorates, UCLA had just begun. I think it was Iowa, NYU, USC, maybe one or two others. I'm not even sure. Very few jobs. And a kind of minuscule field, which was mostly undergrad show movies and bring in some revenue with the amount of attendance you could get. So for me, it was all kind of pioneering, hit and miss, discovering what was possible or engaging. It was a time when film study had a lot of theory in it, so-called, which meant mainly importing methodologies from other disciplines like post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, Marxism, phenomenology, semiotics. All of that was, way beyond what had been the dominant form of film discourse, which were reviews and very astute commentary by amateurs, people who love to write about film, like James Agee, Pauline Kael. So my intent, I think, to put it in Marxist terms, was I was interested in use value. What would be the usefulness of things I could write for others, and to some degree to me, in terms of how could I think out problems that were besieging me. And I've discovered over time in academics, particularly because publishing is often associated with perishing, which is part of that death thing, and no one wants to die. So there's this publish imperative, but it's published within an academic framework. So it means peer reviewing, it means academic presses, and I think one of the key distinguishing marks, it means references to other people's work to prove you know the field, and footnotes, lots of footnotes. So that never interested me as much as others, because I didn't really care about proving I knew things. I wanted to see what I could think of and address that was helpful to other people. So the first book, Movies and Methods, was a collection of essays on these new methods and how they were addressing film questions that I thought others would really want to have under a cover. And I think that continued throughout. It was what can I address and write and work on that would be of use to others. But the specific intention of, what is this book going to be about, was often a little murkier. In many cases, it was more than one thing. It was, like Representing Reality was about, what kind of formal structures, what kind of organizational patterns could I find in the realm of documentary? What issues arise that are distinct, like occurred to me, ethics, because you're dealing with real people. What kind of forms, in terms of, is there a voiceover narrator or not? Is the filmmaker's presence made known or not? And that gets more refined, but those were things that I tried to work through because I thought it would be helpful to others. Because at that point, there wasn't any book that really took up documentary as a kind of language, as a way of thinking about film, the way a genre thinks about film, where you have, assumptions and expectations built into horror, mystery, westerns, and documentaries were more isolated in terms of what do you got on melting glaciers, or what have you got on killers, and then. One of the maxims I remember that still applies to some degree is a documentary is only as good as its subject matter. I think there's some great documentaries about pretty minor subjects like Honeyland, but that still often prevails. And that was part of what I was trying to think through in a different way.
Really good, Bill. Thank you, man. You really articulate. I appreciate this. In fact, Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your book?
Well, now that I'm doing fiction, I would say absolutely none. When I am, because I'm still working on a book in documentary, but when I'm doing nonfiction, I think to some degree, I'm thinking of the reader, not in well, let me put it this way. I'm thinking of the reader in terms of clarity, accessibility, and interest. Am
Yeah.
I putting the point I want to make in a way that is engaging? And am I putting it in a way that is clear? And does it have some coherence to it that would encourage a reader to keep reading? I think those things matter. And I've often found with student writing that if they go to their last page, they have a great beginning. But somehow they've had to work their way through discovering what it is they wanted to say. And if they started there, of course, this would mean taking more time. And often there's deadlines that prevent this from being too realistic. But if they knew what they wanted to say from the beginning, they could get to it a lot quicker. And it's also partly that bugaboo of proving the field, where there's an enormous number of books that will spend a couple of chapters and then intermittently thereafter remind you of who they have read and what they know that helps explain what they're saying, rather than just absorbing that and saying what they have to say. So, I made a vow to myself some time ago, and I haven't quite lived up to it, but to not ever write with footnotes again. So I did an essay recently on Ingmar Bergman's documentaries, two of them about his island, Faroe, and I used some epitaphs, right? There's epigraphs and epitaphs and other epis, but those things at the beginning as quotes that could have been footnotes, but I used those quotes to play off what I wanted to say and avoided footnoting it, because I think footnotes, are part of the academic illness in terms of reaching an audience. There's almost no other field where in reaching a public, one uses footnotes. It's more internal discussion. Lawyers will cite case histories when they're talking to other lawyers, but if they're talking to a jury, they're trying to make a point rather than remind them that I know about what happened in 1905. And, likewise in medicine, if it's a scientific article, there's lots of reference to the other studies and how this study differs and so on. But if you're talking to a patient, you're not going to hand them, off prints of 10 different articles to read and look at my footnotes and so on. So, in terms of audience, I try, clarity to me and accessibility are things that I try to work on in order to serve the reader. Who the reader is and what they're thinking at any given moment is not so much in my mind as trying to sort of be guardian of my own writing process to make it as clear and accessible as I can.
Bill, in the many books and articles you've written, tell me one major element that's stayed the same and one major element that's changed in the years you've been doing this.
Okay. One that stayed the same is that I think I have a bent toward thinking what I would no longer call theoretically, because I think that term's misleading. It's nothing like scientific theory, but I think I have a bent toward thinking conceptually. So most of my writing has some kind of larger frame that I'm trying to think through. And like something I wrote not too long ago was not on a documentary, but on how do documentaries begin? In narrative study, and this was again one of those theories, narratology, a study of narrative in different forms. Beginning and middle and ends are cliches, but a beginning has to do certain things to get a story started. It has to create some kind of suspense. Two men were sitting on a bench. The one fingered the revolver in his left-hand pocket. If you say that, something's going to happen, but you don't know what it is yet. So I was thinking, well, what's that like for documentary? And I came up with 5 or 6 different general types of beginnings that apply, I think, to most documentaries. So that was a conceptual frame. And I think I've had that kind of bent from the very beginning. One of the things, 2 things that have changed. One is a move away from conceptualizing as such, of here's a concept we might want to think about, to applying it to more concrete situations like beginnings. And the other is with documentary. I think when I first started writing about it, the films I had seen at UCLA and that I was teaching in the early days were films that had been made up through the 50s. I mean, there were recent ones too, but there's a history. So you're trying to teach some of the history. And a lot of those were voiceover commentary, relatively didactic, interesting in various ways, but also what I would call similar to a journalistic or historical point of view, trying to give you a perspective on real life situations, often broadly. There were lots of films about World War II, for example, some by Hitchcock and John Ford and Frank Capra and others otherwise, like Victory at Sea, a TV series. But there were tons of them, and that was part of my teaching. It was about what happened on Iwo Jima, what et cetera, what happened in I think it was San Pietro, the town in Italy that John Huston made a documentary about. But over time, and with the evolution of documentaries and from the 60s on, with people observing things and not revealing who they were, but just watching Dylan perform, or music festival films. Most of them didn't have a narrator, like Woodstock and Monterey Pop and so on. And other films that had the filmmaker front and center, like Michael Moore, Errol Morris in a different way, Werner Herzog. There was a real evolution. And I think the thing that changed for me was having to shift my understanding of documentary from a relatively objective, relatively historically centered medium to one that had a very significant degree of subjectivity and individuality to it. So what I was saying in the beginning about representing reality and telling stories, I think became more and more clear that these were not fact claims about truths that we could all agree to necessarily, but rather a perspective on a situation that was the filmmakers that we were invited to agree or disagree with. And Michael Moore, for example, makes his perspective very clear, and he certainly hopes we agree with him. But it's also clear that it's a perspective. He's not trying to claim this is the one and only way of seeing things. This is my way. And when he ambushes Dick Clark to ask him, how come that restaurant or fast food place you own is paying this poor woman less than it costs her to get to work and back and pay for daycare? He just, Dick Clark flees because he doesn't have an answer. And that's not typical of a lot of filmmakers who would say that doesn't respect the subject, it's too subjective, it's too personal. And I think he did overstep when he did the same sort of thing with Charlton Heston once, when Heston wasn't all there because he was having dementia of some form. But it's clear that the whole form had shifted, and I had to shift my thinking to take that into account. Diaristic, poetic documentary work became more and more central.
Really good. We're going to go into Michael Moore for a second now, because Jean-Luc Godard told him when Fahrenheit 9/11 premiered at Cannes, this film is going to help Bush get elected. Now, it didn't help Bush get elected per se, but it galvanized pro-Bushers. With this slew of political documentaries over the recent years, do they more activate or more pacify the viewer?
Well, I think you got to pick some fruit to say which those might be. Um, and I think one of the things that I see more obvious now is what I've just been saying about perspective and subjectivity. So, when I did my MA, I did it on, this is back in the late 60s, early 70s, on Newsreel. And Newsreel was a political filmmaking group attached to the New Left. There were young filmmakers who decided to make films about, draft resistance, the Black Panthers, the San Francisco state strike, which led to one of the very first Black Studies departments, and police riots. And they were blatantly, vividly political. And they were meant for reaching and helping inform and mobilize other people who were already, on the left. Emile D'Antonio, never liked that. He thought, you're preaching to the choir. We need to reach a larger audience. So his films were much more sophisticated and much more engaging in terms of challenging the viewer to make sense of things. And in The Year of the Pig, his film about Vietnam, unlike the newsreel films about it, didn't advocate for North Vietnam and American aggression as such. It presented the perspectives of people from the North and in the South Vietnam government and American officials and soldiers, and did not have any commentary. So we went from one interview, we could hear D'Antonio's voice sometimes, but we went from one interview to another, and one might be a soldier saying, yeah, we kill gooks or something equally appalling, to another of a South Vietnamese villager saying they burn my village and so on. And it was up to you to, make sense of it. The overall gist of it was clearly contrary to the received wisdom promulgated by the US government. It made it clear from even the very opening credits, which were still images and no commentary again, that D saw this as a civil war between North and South to unify Vietnam, which had gotten divided by the French, and not as a war of communist aggression that was going to create a domino that would take over all of Asia. So that was clear, but it was not stated as bluntly as I just did. So I think in terms of where documentaries fit now, I think a lot of the ones that have a political edge also convey a particular perspective, and we can recognize it as, this is how Michael Moore sees things, and whether we agree or not, then it's part of what's up for grabs, rather than this is the way it is, which is, I think, more what Ken Burns likes to do, giving us a sense of now we have the clear, final, objective word on Vietnam, and it is that it was a mistake. And it's kind of namby-pamby, but at least it's comprehensive, I guess I could say. Jill Godmillo has taken sharp issue with that perspective. And again, you realize this is her perspective.
Yeah.
So I think we have to sort out, how much we recognize it's the perspective of the filmmaker, and what how we align ourselves with that perspective. Many films give us some new perspective. I think a number of the ones on global warming help because they give us very vivid images of the impact of warming on the planet that we don't see in San Francisco every day. We get clear signs of it, but not dire, dramatic ones as you do when glaciers calve and huge amounts of ice start melting. So, my sense is that, a vivid, vital, massive political documentary filmmaking effort is kind of missing. It's in absentia. but it is replaced by a very lively and diverse range of views on a range of subjects, many of which do not reach a very giant audience because they don't get into theaters, and COVID has certainly helped prevent that. But nonetheless, give people some of the context and information that they need to make decisions about things. I could give some more examples, but that would be a
That was brilliant, Bill. You brought up so many great things. John Jost was approached by a kid and he said, your film helped me get in the, inspired me to join the Occupy movement. And John goes, don't blame me. It's just like Dylan disowning Masters of War as being, an anthem for the anti-war movement. But Cindy Sheehan said, we're just preaching to the choir, and there ain't even a choir, So, I mean, I'm glad you brought up Emilia D'Antoni. To me, he is one of my absolute heroes, an amazing filmmaker. And what you sussed out in Year of the Pig was so important. And Guido Pontecorvo is another one. Everybody's on their knees to Battle of Algiers, which was used as a training film by George Bush and as a training film by the Black Panthers. And they asked Guido, well, what do you think your film did to people? And he said, teach them how to make a film. It wasn't like do this or that. So I'm curious your take on, McLuhan said there's no such thing as a good or a bad film. It's a good or a bad viewing experience. So just to follow that in the line, I mean, I saw one of Michael Moore's films when he was really hot in a theater, like at like the 1 o'clock showing, the first showing, and it was packed, and everybody cheered and freaked out. And then I went home and watched the evening news. This was back when we watched the evening news, and they said, and this was not in the entertainment section of the news. This was in the hard news. They said, tonight, Michael Moore's new film premiered, and he got 3 things wrong. And I was like, well, dude, I mean, the evening news gets 3 things wrong every night too. But they made his entertainment into hard news, which was to me interesting. So again, I had a great experience watching that film. So just your thoughts on that. No such thing as a good or bad film. It's a good or bad viewing experience.
Well, in general, I think good films lead to good viewing experiences, but what is a good film? I think for the viewing experience, what you referred to with that experience in Michael Moore, one of the qualities of a good experience for cinema historically has been an audience. That is a large group of people gathered in one place with a strong interest in seeing what will be shown. Could be Bergman fans who bring their Bibles with them and want to look up verses. But in general, it's that sense of a shared motivation. The music festival films had that in spades. I remember seeing Monterey Pop when it came out in New York several times. And most of the times, if I looked up at the projector beam, it was like a rainbow because there was so much smoke in the auditorium, which was not from cigarettes, that the projector beam had this rainbow of colors in it that would normally not be visible until it got to the screen. So, that created a kind of community. And sometimes, like Rocky Horror Picture Show, people dancing in the aisles and reciting, lines of what did he say? And then the character would say what, people know he's going to say next. And that is, I think the height of, a good viewing experience when there's that participatory and community shared feeling, which is, I think, going to be a thing of the past to a large degree, as it is already, partly thanks to COVID, and also because of streaming and the online experience with much larger screens, sound systems, the quality of TV streaming material, the series that come out.
Yeah.
So the audience is a delayed audience. It's who you watch it with, but then it's
Yeah.
also who you share that experience of having watched it with on social media and otherwise. So it becomes kind of diffused and delayed rather than immediate. And that there's a book, in fact, called The Immediate Experience, I think some time ago, but it's that idea that you experience it immediately and collectively. And that's part of the pleasure.
Yeah.
One of the great stories about cinema, which may or may not be true, is back in 1895 when the Lumiere brothers were one of the people inventing projecting film. It was all new. No one had cameras, and they had some of the very early equipment and filmed a train arriving at a station and put it on a screen for an audience. And it was just a minute or two. They made a number of these train arrival films, but as the train comes forward, the perspective is coming toward the screen and the audience. And the story is that people jumped out of their seats in fear they're going to be hit by the train. Now, I don't know for sure if that's true or not, but I think that sense of a visceral experience that, filmmakers have learned to magnify to a large degree, certainly in fiction. And now, when I was saying about the change to subjectivity, I think in documentary, that's also true. The use of music, the use of lighting, the use of editing, color, and so on to enhance the degree to which the moment is engaging for the viewer, even if it's a real time situation, is now much more of a priority rather than let's just learn about coal mining and how good or bad it might be, as a more factually oriented experience.
Yeah. In fact, Billy Wilder said, "I just hope they like my movie as much as they like the popcorn."
Maybe more than him.
Peter Greenaway said, "Cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers." Now, you wrote a book on Maya Deren, who's one of the grandmothers of avant-garde film. Are experimental avant-garde filmmakers telling stories a different way or doing something completely different? Like if me and you watch Tony Conrad's The Flicker, that is black and white frames flickering back off and on for 15 minutes. Maybe a story will go through our heads, but it's not really storytelling per se. So just any comments on this line, cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers?
Well, I think I would say it's a good medium to share with people that don't want to tell stories. And a lot of, Frampton, I used to show Flicker in my introduction to film class, along with some of the other challenging avant-garde films that I think are more like abstract expressionism than representation, figuration in art. And they draw attention to the things we take for granted. So they serve that purpose. They draw attention to that images are, that when you hold up a frame, we don't use film that much anymore, but when you hold up a strip of film and look at it, there's nothing moving. And when it's projected, somehow going from image to image to image produces movement. That can be explained, but we'll skip that. But it's that what people like Conrad and Frampton were doing in part was drawing our attention back to the very mechanism that produced the illusions that we were focusing on rather than the reality, like the reality of paint on a canvas that's flat, that these avant-garde guys were doing. And there's a lot of avant-garde filmmakers who work in ways that don't conform to a typical narrative that are still telling stories.
Yep.
I think of, one that I was writing about recently is Lynn Sachs, who I think you interviewed at some point. But Lynn's work, is avant-garde because she's not telling stories in the usual sense and not making documentaries that are expository and explaining situations directly. But a recent film, like a film about a father who, which is about her dad, combines interview, home movies, comments by her family members, footage of her father, and her own narration to say, in essence, I never understood my dad because he was a lively, engaging, wonderful man, and he had more than one partner. I mean,
Yeah.
he womanized, in a word, but no one quite knew how and why and when. And it created, where was he and what was he doing? And near the end, part of the film, we discover that she has a half sister that she never knew existed because there was another family. And, it's all done in a way that gets us thinking about form, which is what I think the avant-garde tends to do, and what Greenaway, in his own way, I think A Pillow Book is a great example of that, tries to do. There's a story, but like with a lot of films, the content of the story and the focus on who does what to whom and why becomes, I wouldn't quite say peripheral, but it becomes one of the many elements that draw us in. And there's the form, the flow, the rhythm, the color, the music, all of which move more to the foreground. And those are things that in, the idea of the fourth wall and classic realist storytelling, which is what most of these people are, calling into question, all of the techniques are meant to be behind the scenes, that the camera cuts from A to B, is done in a way that we don't even notice the edit because the character is moving from one side to the other and the cut is in the middle of the movement. So, the movement continues and we just notice the character moving rather than the cut. And the avant-garde people want to make us clear that it's a cut by maybe making the cut twice and having the character start over and cut again and have the character start over so that we realize what's happening. There's a film about the end of Lady from Shanghai, it's avant-garde, that shows the scene where there's a shootout in the aquarium, that images are fragmented in different mirrors, and that's just repeated over and over to enhance the sense of fragmentation. And it's quite striking, but it's not typical storytelling. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Bill. We fell out there for a second, but you ended with bringing up Lady from Shanghai. You meant Orson Welles' Lady from Shanghai.
Yes. Did I?
Yeah.
Did I not?
No. You may. Yeah, I just want to clarify. That was an amazing example because that's not generally thought of as an avant-garde film as much as that's a mainstream Hollywood film. But Orson Welles was always dabbling in this crossover, I believe.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It may have fallen out then because coming back to Welles is one thing, but I was mentioning another film that uses the shot.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's what I thought.
So,
and what was that film? Do you know?
No, I can't remember offhand.
Okay.
But
it uses the shot from, yes. Okay.
Yeah, so we just see that shot over and over in different ways.
Yeah.
That it freezes the story, but it animates the shot to give us a sense of fragmentation as mirrors break and collapse over and over. Yeah.
It reminds me of Not Film by Ross Lippman about the Samuel Beckett film called Film. Is an amazing film where it breaks down the stuff. But what you talked about was similar to what Andrew Noren said. He said, if you put one frame after another, that is the narrative process, whether it's gobbledygook, jump cuts or, referring back to the medium or whatever, it's still one frame after another. So thank you for doing that. I mean, you really articulated well, and bringing up Lynn Sachs was so important because she is definitely someone I adore and love her films, and she's so articulate as well. I have had several interviews with her, and she's in my book, Strange Questions, my interview with her, but she's also being the interviewer of Craig Baldwin at the May 28th event on stage at the Roxy. Another reason. So this, yeah. So Michael Apted, I talked to him 40 years ago, and I said, why do rock video editors feel so obliged to edit fast? You know, most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but Michael said, well, because we've learned to take in information faster. In fact, Marty Scorsese said this is in the 80s, 40 years ago, when MTV was just starting. He says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So my question is, can we indeed learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
I don't know if it's taking in information or putting higher priority on the sensation of change. You know, that holding an image and watching it unfold over time is a very different experience, particularly when it's protracted, like Wavelength, another avant-garde film where the camera just zooms in across a room for, I think, 45 minutes.
Yep.
The opposite of, you know, fast editing, and slow cinemas like that. I think there's something that I think it's actually kind of like abandoning focus on information in favor of a flood of experiential sensation that is more emotive than cognitive. So it's just the sense of flow, rhythm, pulsation that, you know, matches. If you're doing a rock concert, you know, there's a rhythm to rock that's pretty hot and lively. And if you're just filming it statically, you'll get that. You'll get it from the music. But if you move the camera around and, you know, cut to close-ups and close-ups of the guitar strings and then the drummer and so on, you also get it kinetically in the images. So I think that's part of it. It's sort of like eschewing. I'm no longer primarily interested in having to inform you about what happened as much as engage you with what happened, so that this is what it feels like, you know, rather than here's how you could understand it.
Yeah. You know, that's the symbolist Mallarmé, the poet. He said, don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces. But Bill, I'm curious, the follow-up on the rapid montage question is it literally possible for humans to multitask?
I think it's like what I learned in calculus, that, you know, calculus involves integrating sums over a stretch of time. You know, if you have a curve going up like that, you chop it up into pieces and integrate those pieces, which is what the digital world basically does. And it's the opposite, well, not the opposite, but it's distinct from analog experience where you have gradations. So it's more or less, you know, and then, or, you know, when you break it up, it's you know, and you integrate it and it becomes analog again, but it's actually digital. And I think with multitasking, it's something like that digital experience that we all have in many different ways already, that we're flipping a switch from A to B and doing it very rapidly so that it seems like we're doing two or three things at once. But I think we're really doing one thing at a time, but switching at much faster rates than we used to. And that could be for better or worse. I think it really depends what you're up to. I think it's very hard to, be creative and working on how to shoot a scene or edit a scene or write a scene, and also think about, whether the bread is rising yet in the oven, or, when am I going to water the plants, or sharpening pencils while you're writing, at the same time. But we have, I think, learned to combine things and think we're actually integrating them in a seamless way, much more than we used to.
What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Well, that's one of those depends, I think. Compromise in and of itself would be like a stagnant pond. I mean, there would be no flow or, sort of vitality to it. And conviction in and of itself might be like Yosemite Falls. It's just a flood of one thing, and take it or leave it, and get out of the way before you get drowned. So I think, there's, communication always involves, as it does at this moment, a sender and a receiver. You ask a question and I try to respond. And if you were saying, no, that's not right, what I wanted, and I'm saying, no, this is, don't you hear me? Why can't you, and so on. It would become, maybe interesting to some, but I think basically stagnant. And so I think it's part of a dance of communication in general, that you have to have something to say, and you have to find a way to say it that will be heard. And that means that the two elements have to be in some kind of harmony for everyone involved. If someone feels they're being overwhelmed, or if someone feels it's unclear, or if someone feels I can't make myself heard, they're not listening to me, they're not reading me, etc., that we have an imbalance, and that needs to, be adjusted so that we have a successful communication.
Yeah. It reminded me of John Cage. I have nothing to say, and I'm saying it.
And he did.
He did. So you've accomplished a lot, Bill. Rate these three elements: luck, skill, and ambition. What played the biggest role, second and third?
Luck, skill, and ambition. I would, just to throw a monkey wrench, I would throw in curiosity.
Yeah.
Probably more than luck. And skill, that's a good one. I would say curiosity and ambition would be the ones I would start with. I think you've got to be curious to know more than you know, and to know you don't know it all. It's sort of the unknown known type games. And that you have to pursue and persist, which is the ambition. I think, ambition, it doesn't really mean having a bigger house. It means, to me, in this frame, it means wanting to pursue something to the end, whatever that might mean, not necessarily ultimately, but, and far enough so that you feel like you've actually gained and achieved something in the course of the endeavor. And that, for me, that's driven by a curiosity to know what it is I don't know yet.
Yeah.
So skill, I think, is, tools that we can acquire, and also the tools that are, relatively innate, that we have different levels of ability, so-called IQs, and so on, that, some of us, like I was saying, I feel like I have more of a bent toward the conceptual than some people, but other people have a, far sharper awareness of the detail and factual texture of things that I might miss elements of, because I'm more looking at a big picture. So, I think it's with skill, there's also an awareness of one's strengths and limits, what do I do best and how can I use that skill as well as possible versus, trying to skate on thin ice all the time and hope it all comes out. And luck, that's, I would say, last, but if something happens that appears to be fortuitous, I think the thing I would say that I found, I'm not really sure, but I think is to go with it. That don't be so locked into a frame of how one should do things or what is coming or is possible, that when you're lucky enough to have an opportunity to explore or do something different, think about it. And if it seems like it will actually take you somewhere, there's probably a good reason it happened, but you've got to seize the moment.
Seize the moment. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. I love you adding I love it, really well put, Bill, because I love you adding curiosity, because just because I say three choices, people sometimes go, well, I'll add another one. And just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Karen Gedney, the woman who spent 30 years behind bars as an MD. And she said her 3 C's are curiosity, collaborating, and compassion. And I love that word curiosity, you bringing that up. But the wording, and see, it's like me and you versus the wording on my questions. I'm always into challenging, figuring out, what verb should I use there better and how could I change it? And so the question used to be, is ambition based more on fear or joy? And 80% of people would go fear. And so it was like a little limiting because it was too much like a yes or no. And then I read William Friedkin said a couple of years ago, he said, in Hollywood, skill and luck have nothing to do with it. It's all ambition. So then I changed the question to, is ambition based more on, or no, excuse me, I changed the question as your accomplishments are based on luck, skill, and ambition. So T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Part of it's in images and part of it's in fragments and part of it's in narratives where I'm putting things together. In many cases, it's a function of something I've already experienced and then reworking it. Particularly if something was particularly loaded in good or bad sense, I have a tendency to want to rework it and rethink it. And sometimes that leads to new things. It certainly leads to helping me revise my past in a favorable way. But, I think we all probably are prone to that. Memory is not locked in a vault. We're constantly reconstituting our histories by dint of new memories that are how we chain things together in our inner dialogues. And I think for me, again, it's a fair bit of it is curiosity of, what's going on? What are people around me doing? Why is that person in the seat over there reading that book, and what are they getting out of it? And why is this person looking around nervously? Or what's the person in the wheelchair thinking when they get on a subway? Do they think they need to challenge and fight for their space, or are they grateful? There are things like that that are going through my head a lot, which may or may not have anything to do with something I'm writing, but it's not quite the stream of consciousness that the Joycean types had in mind, I think, but there may be elements of that too.
Sounds like it. In fact, Chris Marker said, if the images of the present don't change, then change the images of the past. So,
Yeah.
I'm curious what you just said, Bill, though. Images, fragments, narrative. That's your inner dialogue sort of described in words. In fact, you'll love this. Abigail Child, I says, what form is your inner, or, you know, what language is your inner dialogue in? And she says, I wish I knew. Which I
Yeah.
really think is a beautiful thing, because but what your sort of route to start pursuing like high school into college was like what? Chemistry, medical, that path. And then it sort of morphed into this thing, images, fragments, and narratives, in the sort of documentary sense. Deep delve into why we make documentaries and what are they. What is the roots back then of you going into medicine and chemistry first? Was that the way your parents raised you, on your own? How do you explain that?
No, my parents weren't much of an influence that way. My father was an alcoholic and a non-parent, really, more of a problem than a help. And my mother was partly enabling because we had to live through that most of my childhood, and also the armature that kept the family together. So she, was supportive, loving in her own way, but very open-ended about. She didn't have a career path that she thought I should follow. She wanted me to follow one that I would appreciate, benefit from and do well in. So
Yeah.
she was a teacher herself, and her side of the family was all people who, including her mother, who was secretary of Methodist Church in Jacksonville, were people who saw service as a very important part of life. It had a religious element for them, but I think it, has a secular import as well. And I know in high school I was thinking of medicine, uh, the ministry, and um, I don't know what else. I think those two, maybe literature in some vague way, but I didn't have a clear sense, even in college, of what I wanted to do. And I thought the courses I took in the humanities and the courses I took in the sciences could somehow come together in medicine, because it was a healing art and serve
Yeah.
people, and there would be ways of, as a number of doctors have, having a literary career too. There are a number of writers who also had a medical background. Um, and that didn't work out for me for, one reason or another. And I took another, like I call it a zigzag path, going
Yeah.
here and there in different ways. But the idea of doing something that was of value, it was like the use value question again. And
Yeah.
I think, I discovered when I was in the Peace Corps that my mother's calling to teaching and to being a teacher was one that I enjoyed. So I didn't think of it when I was going to UCLA initially because of thinking of screenwriting, but part of the draw of film studies and the history and criticism of film was that you could teach it. And,
Yeah.
that began when I was a grad, because we got to TA in courses, and I got a job at San Bernardino teaching part-time while I was still a grad. And that grew on me. I think communicating things I knew to others in a way that made it feel important to them became one of the things that really got me excited. So
Yeah.
it was an evolution, I think, over
Yeah.
time that led me, ironically, back to what my mother did, although I never thought of it that way until you asked me.
Well, it's funny, Bill. You must have ESP, or one of us has ESP, because about 1 second before you said the word use value, I wrote it in my notes. It says, is this use value? And all of a sudden you said it. But you're really articulate, and I appreciate it. In fact, two of my film heroes have their mantras. George Manupelli said, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self-expression or more vehicles for whatever cultures, technologies, and environments are dominant?
There's I think it's a 4-volume Arnold Hauser history of art that tries to link the way art in different time periods is a function of the overall environment. And it's certainly true to a degree. And then within that environment, there are very different takes by very different artists. And, my sense is that if you're creating, the urge to create does not come from the conscious mind. I could say, I'm going to write a novel, but that kind of thinking isn't going to produce the story on the page. It gets me started, and I could say it's going to be about a character who is pushed to an extreme, et cetera. And I could go on with that. And that might be what would help me create a plot. But when it comes to the scene where the character's walking to a meeting and, just to make it simple, has a gun in their pocket and is debating whether they're going to use it in some way, if that's all being calculated by the conscious mind, I don't think it's going to work. And that's where the artist at the, concrete specific moment of that is unfolding in the story or event, if it's not a story, has to shut up. And it's not just the character, but it's the storytelling apparatus itself, or the experiential apparatus, if it's more avant-garde, that somehow comes up, out of the depths, which is why I love that painting that's behind me on the wall.
Yeah.
It's, of an open pit mine. And I have another one by the same artist, and, it has, on one level, it's a factual painting. It's a mine. It's kind of white material, and it's a dark pit, and there's people moving things around. But to me, it also is the unconscious. It's that dark realm we don't see or understand, and yet we know it's there. Like everything I'm saying right now is not typed. I don't have it to read, and it's coming out from somewhere. And I know I'm speaking, and you're speaking, and you have quotes, amazing array of quotes you prepared. But, the very words I'm saying at this very moment, I couldn't have predicted a minute ago that I'm going to be saying them. It's coming from somewhere else. And this is just conversation. But, if you're creative, the ultimate source is that part of us that is not aware of what we're doing. And sometimes people talk about letting the character speak, and I think from my experience that's really true. And it's also the world the character's in. It takes on a life that the writer, a lot of people say, well, I'm just the stenographer, or I'm taking notes, or dictation, and they're inadequate in some way. But I think the metaphor has a root truth to it. It's my phone was ringing. Okay.
Well, Bill, what's the last name of the painter? Because you brought him up last podcast, and I didn't quite get his name. The painter's last name in back of you.
Oh, okay. This is a painting by Chester Arnold,
Oh,
and
Chester Arnold. Okay. Yeah.
yeah,
I just wanted to
this
get
one.
it.
He's a California painter. He's got a very unmistakable style. These pit paintings are just one of many things. A lot of them have geography or landscape in them. Um, he's reasonably well known, but not a household name. And uh, I love the two pit paintings I have.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it really stands out. It's beautiful. And it was a major part of how we ended the last podcast. But the follow-up question is, can art making be egoless?
Egoless.
Yeah.
That's funny because I was on an art commission in another town here a while back, and it was called Art and Culture Commission, and the commission was actually far more culture than art. We were supporting symphony, performances and July 4th festivals and chalk days for kids, and that was all fine. But public art was very much in absentia, and I
Yeah.
was pushing for public art, and it was a huge battle that I sort of gave up on because I moved. But at one point, when I was saying we really need to see if we can focus on public art and get some more, almost any really good art to go along with the events we sponsor, one of the other commissioners said, "When I think of art, I think of egos." It really flabbergasted me because I think of almost anything but. And the effect, the aesthetics of it, the impact, the quality, um, the meaning, or sort of significance in a context that any given piece might have, whether it's a novel or sculpture. So it really sort of took me aback, and I still don't know quite what to make of that. I think on the one hand, like ambition, the artist has to have an ego because they want to have their say. They want others to attend to what their self compels them to produce. But I think the compulsion is personal. It's not so much I want an audience and I need an audience or I'll die. It's more I have a voice in me telling me to do something with words or images or pictures or paint or film that I cannot not listen to. There was, you like these quotes from different famous people. So there's one, I don't have a lot of them, but Isadora Duncan, was asked once, "Why do you dance?" And she said, "Well, if I could say it in words, I wouldn't have to dance it."
Yeah,
And
you actually brought that up last time, and I
last
looked it
time,
up, and it
yeah,
goes like this. Tell meant there would be no point in dancing it. And it really is a beautiful thing for her to say, being a dancer,
yeah,
and that's her livelihood. She's like, hey, there would be no point.
yeah. And I think it's like that with, say, for example, Scorsese. He could talk about what it's like to be in a remote cabin and worry that a convict you put in jail is coming to get your family, or he could make Cape Fear, and
Yeah.
he could talk to Dylan or talk about Dylan, but it's not the same as making a film where he talks to Dylan and includes clips and sort of showcases and explores Dylan's career. And
Yeah.
if he could have said the film without making the film, he probably wouldn't need to make it. But that need, I don't think it's an ego thing.
Yeah.
People get, we have a world of celebrities and, Kardashian lookalikes and talkalikes whose main achievement is nothing more than getting noticed. But I think art is different. When I early on in this, I mentioned the cavemen, and I think that need to tell stories is, the guy who told the best story among the cavemen, I don't think got to sit on a throne or got his picture in the paper. It was just that he had that compulsion to talk and
Yeah.
tell a story that maybe others remembered, or put it on a stone in a way that got preserved. And, that I think is a human need that some of us have more than others. And in many cases, it's perishable. We don't need to have something that others will see and share, but we still have a need. Maybe it's just in our inner dialogue or in our conversation with others to tell stories and make our presence felt as partly bearing witness to who we are.
Yeah. 80%, 90% of people, when I say, can art making be egoless? They go, no. And about a year ago, a woman said, great art is egoless. And then a couple months ago, a woman said, art has to be egoless. So it is interesting how we figure out what that word, like the gentleman you mentioned said art and ego, he had a particular perception of what that word meant for him. Like Lily Tomlin says, reality is just a collective hunch. We're all sort of kind of collectively trying to figure out, well, what does this word ego mean? Because of Freud and all that. So the next question is perception reality?
No. I'll be short for once, but no, I think this is like the representing reality. I think we see things, and we see things,
Yeah.
both, we see things,
Yeah.
and we see things, and I don't see things you see. And,
Yeah.
I can't make them out, but I can see behind you a lot of things, but I don't see things the way you do, because I don't know who the woman in the picture is. And, it's too murky to tell. And you can't tell what books are on my shelf. But I could see someone who seems to have a big ego, and someone else may see someone who's really just entertaining.
Yeah.
And, someone could see Rodney King getting beaten by a number of policemen way back when, or George Floyd. But King was controversial because in the trial, the defense lawyer said, what you see are police defending themselves against a man trying to get up and attack them.
Yeah.
And it was a very powerful defense. It got a not guilty verdict in the first trial.
Yeah.
So he got people to see things that I would say weren't there, but it could be seen if you frame it in a way where, if you have A causes B, and then you reverse it, so now B is causing A. And it's possible to do that with succession of events, because it's a chain. And if you start with B instead of A, you're suddenly seeing Rodney King trying to get up rather than repelling a blow. And trying to get up means you've got to hit him. So the hit is a response rather than a cause. So how we see things is, a perceptual issue. There's a great book by J.G. Gibson about perception and its many myriad subjective dimensions that, have all kinds of consequences. But reality is not quite the same thing.
Yeah.
It is a hunch. But,
it is on
better than others.
What is the book again? Gibson, G-I-B?
Gibson. And I read it long time ago, but it's something like Perception of Reality. I'm not sure the title.
Okay. I'll check it out. I appreciate that. And Bill, again, we didn't even get to my 5 pages of documentary notes. Can you go a little longer now? Well, I asked for 90 minutes, so it's up to you. We could go up more time now, or hopefully do another session sometime in the future. These have been truly enlightening for me. I don't know if you're willing. I'm not, I'm sort of begging you, but I'm saying I'm encouraging you, but I don't know how much more time you want to go now, because you might have scheduled.
I do. I have something coming up, but it's not immediate deadline. So I know we started a little early, but if you want to go 10 or 12, maybe 15 more
Right.
minutes, I can do
Let's
that.
let's go about 10, 15 more minutes, and then we can decide if you can do another. But this was really fun so far. And, this is Moshe Feldenkrais says he works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, you're right. This doesn't have much to do with documentary. A good one, I think, would be talking.
Yeah.
I, as a kid, was quite shy, and the whys of that are another story. But at the time, I thought it was innate. That I thought shyness was like genetic. I couldn't be anything but, because that's how I am. And it was partly, if not largely, through teaching that I realized that it was a condition. Shyness is a condition that is brought about in an environment where talking is risky or the reward is not very great. And that when you teach, the reward is high, and standing there like a dummy in the front of a classroom is not particularly rewarding. So, I learned to speak over time. And when I first started teaching in full time in Canada, it was almost immediately I was doing a large intro class. And, it was a smallish university, so it wasn't huge, but it was over 100 people. So it was in an auditorium, and, it was a performance. So I began experimenting with all kinds of ways of enhancing the performance quality, which, is much easier now with the internet, and images can just pop up readily. But at that time, it involved slide projectors and finding a place in a 16 millimeter film to get into the projector at the right place. So it's 13 minutes and 4 seconds into a 60-minute reel. It was very hard to get all that stuff together, or clips that were on a audio tape, and, maybe having other people interacting in the course of it on stage. But I had things like that, and someone coming in to the auditorium on a motorcycle and delivering a reel of film. And I was beginning to invent ways of performing, which, along with those things I was talking about before, about trying to be clear and accessible, and, understandable, became preoccupations. And I found, over time, that particularly when I had a license to speak, so to speak, like now in an interview, that I could find a level of articulation that I would never have imagined possible. If I'm just on a train with someone and they say, what do you do? It may be a little harder for me to get started on that, because there's still some residue from the past. But I've realized that one of the things that, and I think you have it in spades, but one of the things that makes talking easy is curiosity. If you're curious about what's, rather than I need to have something, time to say what I want to say, but, curious about what would be of interest. With a large audience, you don't know what each person wants, but you can leave time for Q&A or make it open for questions to come, and you can try to anticipate what people will think. And you have your, abundance of quotes that you've spent time assembling to stimulate and provoke thought without knowing where it's going to go. Those things, in this case, get me thinking in ways that I could not predict, because your questions are unpredictable. And it, somehow brings out, that inner speaker that's not the conscious mind again, where I've got a, like notes and a plan of I'll say this and I'll say that, because, that's something I'm working on, but it's not relevant to what we're doing.
Yeah, Bill, I worked for George Carlin for half a year, and we got a flyer in the mail once, and it said, "I'm trying to get more control over my spontaneity."
Yeah, that's like saying be spontaneous, but
Yeah.
yeah.
But the word risk really got me, because Leonard Cohen says the only way you can sell a concert is to put yourself at risk. And if you don't do that, people know. So, that's amazing, because that's like the only way you can sell a lecture or get your students to pay attention. I mean, I'm always amazed they don't send teachers to acting school or performance school. They just say, okay, learn this stuff. Now you should know how to teach. And so many people I interview say, I wasn't taught how to teach. I learned on the job. And so this whole thing is, and if you don't do that, people know. It's almost like the students know that you're going through this. But what you've sort of talked about, what role does risk play in this process of educating? What does courage mean to you now? Like, how do you have the courage, or where is the roots of the courage, or is courage involved in risk taking?
Oh yeah. I think, part of it, you know, on a more personal level, part of it is courage and taking risks of examining your past.
Yeah.
We all have stories we tell. We all have ways we understand how we've gotten to where we are. And sometimes we find ourselves hitting walls or things coming up that are, not helpful in the present. And it may be puzzling, because you've got skills, like we were saying, and knowledge and experience. So why would something come up that's not as helpful as it might be? And sometimes that calls for re-examining the past, and it may call for shaking up things we assume that we've either managed, mastered, gotten beyond, know all about, and yet don't. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's re-examining our own story. And sometimes I think it's looking at things we see around us that we first think of as noise and, therefore discountable, and then realizing there's a kind of pattern to it and it's not just noise and you don't understand it. I
Yeah.
think, without turning it into a political thing, I think, the rise of the right wing extremism in the last many years has had that quality for me, because I knew there were always, right wingers. The FBI never paid much attention to them till recently, but because their focus was on the left wing and communism initially. But, and it seemed like noise, just, troublemakers here and there. And then it, began to consolidate, and it, left, I think, me and many sort of speechless of what is underlying all of this.
Yeah.
What are the factors that bring people together in hate and fear? And, we could just, like Hillary Clinton made that very unfortunate remark about despicables, but
Yeah.
it's more than that. It's more than a label, because people who are otherwise very intelligent or sensitive or aware or suffering, can be drawn into a worldview that is not particularly compassionate. And it's
Yeah.
not clear how that happens. And it takes, some courage and some willingness to risk assumptions to explore it. So I would say those are examples. You mentioned Leonard Cohen, and when I was giving a talk recently, I I tried to do my Leonard Cohen imitation. So I'll try. Forget your precious offerings. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think that sentiment, that's the old Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
But that our nicely form-fitting world of ideas has cracks. And
Yeah.
it's sometimes in the cracks rather than in the formidableness of our coherence that light gets in, that shines things in ways we don't expect, and that we need the courage to be able to see that.
So well put. Beautiful Leonard Cohen too, Bill. Just in closing, what you said was taking the risk to examine the past and our own story. I'm currently making a film on archiving. Like, why do humans feel they have to archive? Most people our age don't even know what they're going to do. Like all your notes and all your papers, what is that? What's going to happen to that? Do you have it going to a college archive, or do you just expect one of your loved ones or friends to take care of it? It's a hard thing for us to tackle as we get older. And Ram Dass said, be here now. So why, if we're going to live here now, why should we worry about what happened, whether it's, the past? Of course, studying history is important, and that's in a lot of ways what we're doing. But Wyndham Lewis said an amazing thing. He said, the artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. Now, it sort of sounds like gobbledygook, but it's like, we're living here now in the present. We're exchanging dialogue. Why do we have to examine the past is sort of known, but is the past examination mean stuff, boxes, labels, actual material? Why is that, part of it, as opposed to telling our own story, memory? Believe me, it's a lot of gobbledygook, and my question isn't focused, but any ideas on this idea, like humans archiving, why?
I think at some levels, people who have made considerable achievements and have involved others in various ways, their archives can be of great value to us because they let us see aspects that they themselves never promoted or celebrated or showed a light on, but they have records that reveal them. Just to quickly amplify that, there was a very shocking, well, not shocking, but surprising example with Kirk Douglas, where his archive is in Madison, and they have a lot, Emile D'Antonio's archives there too. And I was doing a book on the post-war American history period and was looking through Douglas's archive as part of study on the blacklist, because he helped break it when Dalton Trumbo wrote Spartacus, and he got credit rather than being affronted, fronted by somebody pretending to be him, an anonymous name. And Douglas was very proud to take credit for that. But what I found in the archive was that event in 1960 was the tip of the iceberg. And Douglas never talked about this. And he still, he's passed, but he never did, because I interviewed him and he still made light of it, which is that in the 50s, while the blacklist was in effect, he had on his payroll for his company, which was, he was one of the people doing independent production in the Hollywood system, that for his company, he had at least half a dozen blacklisted writers, including John Howard Lawson, who is one of the sort of ringleaders because he was an avowed communist and a successful screenwriter, and others who were more or less sympathetic to communism, some in the party, some not. Ring Lardner Jr., Dalton Trumbo, and so on. But they were getting paid, and I found a spreadsheet handwritten with their names, the title of the films they were writing, and the amount they were paid, dating from the mid-50s. I think I shared it in Cineast at some point much later. But it was part of what Douglas did without ever calling attention to it. And when I asked him about it, he still said, "Oh yeah, well, I forgot about that. I'm not sure." He didn't really want to put the spotlight on himself, except for Spartacus. And I thought it was very interesting. It's partly Hollywood protectionism. You don't want to, stand out too far for your political views because you never know who you're going to deal with. But I think it was also a genuine kind of modesty that he was doing something that had to be under the table at the time. And there was no reason to let his ego put it up in front of the table now. So, it was a very interesting thing.
Bill, what's beautiful is I think you have the ability to stand back and suss out the big picture. You're a comprehensivist, and you can understand it's partly Hollywood protectionism and genuine modesty, and helping these guys. And I think that's the importance of archiving and history, is that maybe we can get a bigger picture, a more comprehensive picture, but it's still leaving something out. Because again, I mean, this is something I'd love to delve into in a third episode, is this whole thing of giving the picture. Well, it's basically fly on the wall or fly in the soup. When the documentarian takes on a subject, how much are they going to sneak in their own? And you covered it so well. And I think Crumb is one of the pinnacles of, like, you decide, or Capture in the Freedmans, and it's endless. That the titles, you're so comprehensive with documentaries, and I've studied them so deeply over the years. It's like just picking the subject is a point of view. And it's like the McLuhan quote we could delve into is, understanding is not having a point of view. We think when we understand something, it's because we like it or we dislike it, So we can close out here now, Bill. I mean, it's just been such a delight, and I'm really grateful for your time and energy. Hope to see you May 28th, and if not, someday we can meet in person. But feel like what you've communicated to me is deep, and I have to process all these notes a lot to get well, like we say, is get knee deep in the swamp muck.
Yes. Well, you get me thinking in ways I don't normally think, so I appreciate your questions a lot. Thank you for the interview.
Thanks again, Bill. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button again, I'll say I hope we can keep talking forever and ever. Thank you so much.
Okay. Look to see you on the 28th if I can possibly do it. Take care.
All right. Thank you.